Damien Leclerc was not the kind of man who came home early. His schedule was a carefully constructed fortress, designed to keep his time occupied from dawn until well past midnight. Meetings bled into power lunches into strategy sessions into networking dinners, and networking dinners into after-hours negotiations. If he returned to his sprawling glass and steel estate before the city's lights had begun to blur into the ink of the night sky, it usually meant something had gone catastrophically wrong in one of his companies. But tonight was different. Tonight, there was no crisis. No call from a panicked investor. No whispered rumors of an impending market shift. Instead, there was only a strange, persistent restlessness that had dogged him since late afternoon, growing heavier with each passing hour until it was impossible to ignore. The feeling was subtle at first, like the sensation of someone watching from a distant shadow. He'd been sitting in the leather-backed chair in his downtown office, listening to a senior executive pitch yet another expansion plan, when it came over him fully. A prickling along the back of his neck, a quiet urge to be somewhere else entirely. The urge made no sense. Damien rarely acted on impulse, it wasn't in his nature. Yet when the meeting ended, instead of moving on to the charity gala where his presence was expected, he found himself telling his driver to take him home. No detours, no stops. Straight to the estate. The driver glanced at him through the rearview mirror, a question in his eyes, but said nothing. The city thinned as they drove. Neon signs gave way to long stretches of shadowed roads lined with trees that bent and whispered in the wind. Damien's estate sat far from the restless heartbeat of the city, tucked behind a set of wrought iron gates that opened only at the recognition of his car's plate. The driveway wound upward, flanked by manicured hedges and low, elegant lighting that painted the path in gold. Normally, the sight of the house waiting for him, its broad glass facade glowing warmly against the night, brought a quiet satisfaction. Tonight, however, the house seemed still in a way that made the pit of his stomach twist. The moment he stepped inside, he noticed the silence. The usual hum of background life was absent. No faint clinking of dishes from the kitchen. No distant vacuum drone from the hallway carpets. Not even the soft shuffling of footsteps belonging to Maria, the live-in maid who had, over the last 2 years, made herself both indispensable and invisible in equal measure. It wasn't unusual for her to keep to herself in the evenings, but something about this silence was different. It felt deliberate. As though the house itself was holding its breath. Damien loosened his tie, hanging it over the back of a chair as he moved through the hallway. The polished marble floor reflected his steps in muted echoes. It was then he heard it, faint, irregular, out of place. Snip, snip, snip. A sharp, metallic sound breaking the stillness. He paused, listening more closely. The sound was coming from the far end of the hall, beyond the kitchen, past the guest bath. The laundry room. The thought puzzled him. Why would anyone be in the laundry room this late? His mind flicked to Maria. She had a habit of staying up to finish chores no one had asked her to do, pressing table linens at midnight, polishing already gleaming silverware, but she usually worked quietly, her movements almost ghost-like. This was different. This was deliberate, rhythmic, and oddly, intimate. Damien walked down the hall, the sound growing clearer with each step. When he reached the laundry room door, it was ajar. A thin slice of light spilled into the hallway, catching on the dust motes in the air. He pushed the door open. At first, the sight didn't register. Maria sat on the small wooden stool in front of the dryer, her back to him, shoulders squared. Her long dark hair, always pinned into a tidy bun, was loose, except that half of it was gone. Strands lay scattered across the tiled floor like fallen ribbons. In her right hand, she held a pair of scissors, in her left, a thick lock she had just severed. Her movements were measured, almost ritualistic. She reached for another section of hair, twisted it tightly, and cut again. Damien froze in the doorway. "Maria?" His voice was low, cautious. She didn't flinch. Didn't turn. Didn't acknowledge him at all. The only answer was the sound of the scissors again. Snip. Another lock fell. He took a step forward, his shoes whispering against the tile. "What are you doing?" Still no answer. Her gaze remained fixed on the small, slightly warped mirror propped against the wall in front of her. The glass caught his reflection as he drew closer, but she didn't meet his eyes through it. "I asked you a question," he said again, softer now, though there was an edge of concern creeping into his voice. He had seen Maria upset before, briefly, fleetingly, but never like this. Never with such fierce, silent determination. Only when he was close enough to see the fine tremble in her fingers did she finally speak. "I have to." The words were quiet, almost swallowed by the hum of the overhead light. Damien frowned. "Have to what?" Her hand hesitated over another lock of hair. For a moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, without looking at him, she said, "If I don't, they'll find me." The scissors stilled in her lap. The air in the room seemed to tighten, as though the walls themselves were leaning in to hear more. "Who?" Damien asked. His voice had lost its earlier firmness, now it carried something else entirely, a thread of unease he couldn't quite name. Maria finally looked at him, and for the first time in all the months he'd known her, there was no trace of the polite reserve she wore like a uniform. Her eyes were dark and unguarded, heavy with something that went beyond fear. "The people I ran from," she said, each word deliberate, as if speaking them aloud was an act of defiance. "The people who will never stop looking." Damien's mind began to race. He didn't know who she meant, but the conviction in her tone was undeniable. He'd hired Maria through an agency that had vouched for her. She'd passed every background check, every reference call. But now, watching her methodically strip herself of something as personal as her hair, he realized there were pieces of her story he had never been told. She dropped another lock to the floor. It landed on the growing pile at her feet. He didn't know why, but the sight of it sent a cold current through him. And though he had no way of knowing it then, this quiet, strange night, the night he came home early, would mark the point where his orderly life began to unravel.